ahead and get started since it is 2:30. Welcome and thank you for joining us. This is probably the second or third event we've done in the Senate this year, really to highlight career and technical education. My name is Steve DeWitt. I'm with the Association for Career and Technical Education, and we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization that represents the people who are teaching career and technical education, administrators, teachers, career guidance professionals, etc. Before I begin, I want to thank our Senate Career and Technical Education Caucus for hosting this event. And I'd also like to thank a few of the co-chairs and their staff, including Karishma Merchant with Senator Tim Kaine's office, Alan Ernst from Senator Rob Portman's office, Brian Moulton from Senator Tammy Baldwin's office, and Nancy Martinez from Senator Todd Young's office, who just joined as one of our co-chairs. And I also would like to point out that February is Career and Technical Education Month, so we're especially happy to be here today to really talk about the past, present, and future of career and technical education. So the first thing we're going to do is have Kim Green, who works for Advanced CTE, come up and give us a brief history really about career and technical education. She is with Advanced CTE, as I mentioned. They represent state directors and state leaders who are responsible for secondary, post-secondary, and adult career tech ed across all 50 states. Kim?
Thanks, Steve, and welcome. I don't know if this is a turning point in my career when I'm now the person that people turn to say, can you give the history of? But I have also been given the challenge of giving 100 years of history in 5 minutes. So I did grow up in Buffalo, so I'll talk as fast as I can, but obviously this will not be a comprehensive overview, although I thought if we could do drunk history in 5 minutes, that might have been more fun. So let me take you back to, we're going to talk about the past. The Smith-Hughes Act, which is the very first piece of federal vocational education legislation, was passed on February 23rd in 1917. So to put that in context, this legislation passed before the beginning of World War I, before we passed the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave Americans the right to vote. It was before the New Deal. It was before Brown versus Board of Education, before McDonald's was founded. It was before Neil Armstrong took the first step on the moon. And in more recent years, it was before Facebook, Twitter, a laptop. Since it's the season of the Grammys, it was before rock and roll, punk rock, boy bands, or rap. So it has a long history, but in the federal policy context, it also passed before literally every other piece of federal education and workforce legislation. It came before the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Higher Education Act, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and the many precursors for WIO, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. I do want to acknowledge Gary Moore's article in the Techniques magazine, which is ACTE's magazine. He was the president of ACTE, and I drew a lot of my remarks from his article, so I want to acknowledge that. So Smith-Hughes, as I said, was celebrating its 100 years, and it was really a pioneering piece of legislation. In some ways, the conditions that surrounded the passage of Smith-Hughes remain true today. In 1904, it was a dean at the college, at Cornell School of Agriculture, that said, the child lives in one world and goes to school in another. And so if you think about that statement and think about the challenges that were facing the economy then, it was really about thinking, how do we get more students to persist in education? At that time, 95% of students that were going to public education went through until they were at the end of elementary school. Only 5% went to high school. We were on the cusp of a transition from an agrarian to an industrial economy. And there was a group of thought leaders, both in education and the workforce, who said that if we're going to continue to innovate in our economy, we need to make education more relevant. We need to have education be something that individuals see as a way of moving to and toward opportunity and innovation. So with the impetus of a national society, the promotion of industrial education, which was a coming together, as I said, of education and industry, the Smith-Lever Pass was passed in 1914. And this will sound very familiar to those of you who work in Congress. It was a piece of legislation that created a study commission. We love study commissions. And it was a study commission to say, should the federal government do anything about vocational education? Is this a space that we should enter? Because the federal government had never previously invested in education. And the study commission said, yes, we need to move forward. And so Smith, who was a Georgian senator, who was an attorney by profession and was also the chair of the Senate Education and Labor Committee, and Hughes, who was a farmer, who was the chair of the House Education Committee, both again from Georgia, introduced a piece of legislation which was eventually signed by President Woodrow Wilson, the Smith-Hughes Act. And why this is important to celebrate and recognize today is that many of the foundations that we see in the federal legislation today actually harken back to the 1917 legislation. So to be clear, this legislation wasn't the beginning of vocational education. In fact, there was a lot that was happening across the country, but this should sound familiar to you as well, that there was a lot of investments that were variable across the country, depending on what state you lived in, depending on what community you lived in. You may or may not have access to a vocational education program. You may or may not have access to a quality program. So when we look back at Smith-Hughes, these are essential foundational tenets of that legislation, which I think will sound very familiar to you. One of them is checking
because we're live streaming
and it's not turning on. So one was that this legislation was about improving the quality of vocational education and establishing standards for programs. It was about stating that the purpose for vocational education was to prepare people for useful employment. It required a state board for vocational education. It required that all the funds that were invested from these dollars were held in the control and were accountable to the public, so that they had to be part of public education. And it required that students who were part of these programs had to spend at least 50% of their time on hands-on and practical programs. Some of the things that we've lost along the way were that it required a dollar-for-dollar match, so every dollar that a state got had to be, or every dollar they got from federal dollars had to be matched by the state. And that in order for the state to get money, they had to make sure they had qualified teachers in order to be able to deliver these programs. So as the economy evolved, so too did the federal investment. Smith-Hughes eventually gave way to the Vocational Education Act of 1963, and that was the precursor legislation to the Perkins Act, which passed in 1980. These different transitions really show how the federal legislation was both a foreshadowing in some ways, a reflection, or responded to the economy. I've got 5 minutes to do 100 years, so I'm going to keep talking while you're making that technology work. So between 1936 and 1956, there were a series of pieces of legislation passed that expanded the focus so that we could, originally Smith-Hughes focused on only agriculture, home economics, and trade and industries. And over the years, as the needs of our country changed, in particular during World War II, when we had critical industries where we needed additional workers, the federal legislation responded to that. We also saw during World War II, this was when we saw the emergence of a focus on student leadership and community support. So vocational education prided itself in having its students plant victory gardens or sell war bonds or fix agricultural equipment that was so needed, especially at a time of rationing. So you can see the vestiges of our career technical student organizations. In 1963, the legislation shifted to a strong focus on access and equity, noting that vocational education, quote, needed to support persons of all ages in all communities. And this is when we took a shift of the funding going out by program area to funding that went out by population. And it was the first time ever that funding went out to support individuals who had academic challenges, were economically disadvantaged, or were disabled. And remind you, this is before the passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. In 1976, there was a strong focus on women and girls and the introduction of gender equity. This time it was a reflection and kind of lagging from the passage of Title IX, which passed in 1972. In 1984 was the first time that Perkins was passed, and we became kind of known as the Perkins Act. This was in the shadow of the passage of Nation at Risk, and that legislation really sought to try to have a strong focus on guidance and advisement, to have partnerships between industry and education, and it was the first time that program evaluation measures were put in place where this legislation had to be responsive to the needs of the labor market. In 1990, Perkins 2 was passed, again having a stronger focus on accountability measures, but also is the first time and still the only piece of federal legislation that looks at connecting secondary and post-secondary education. At that time, it was through the innovation funding of tech prep. In more recent years, and I'll say this is when I entered into the work, it was Perkins 4, 3, and 4, who again were reflections of what was happening not only in the economy and in the education worlds, but society. So Perkins 3 came on the heels of massive efforts to block grant legislation. And I'll tell you, having worked through this, it was efforts because Perkins and CTE sits at the intersection of education, workforce, and economic development. There were efforts made to block Grant Perkins into education bills, into workforce bills, and even into welfare bills. All of those efforts failed largely due to a coalition of education organizations working together, but you can see the intentionality in Perkins 3 of connecting to the workforce system. That was the Workforce Investment Act, the precursor to WIOA. And Perkins 4, well, that came right after No Child Left Behind had passed, so we saw a very strong impression of stronger accountability and increasing the academic rigor of our programs, and importantly, the signaling mechanism of changing the name from vocational education to CTE. So while many may not characterize CTE as a trailblazer or a groundbreaking, I think when you think about it in terms of federal policy and you look at kind of what was in federal policy, in many ways it does meet those terms. It was the first piece of ever federal legislation that invested in education. It foreshadowed things like a focus on access and equity, serving individuals with special needs, serving gender equity, and having strong accountability provisions. So as we reflect on the 100-year anniversary, I think about kind of what can we learn in the past and what is before us. And certainly the federal pendulum swings kind of to and fro as to where the center of gravity and where the support stands for, whether it should be federally led or state-led. But I do see that there are some emerging themes that have stood the test of time. One of them is it's important to make learning relevant for students. We have a responsibility to make sure that kids understand what they're learning and how it applies to their future and future opportunities. Two is that it's important for us to connect our learning to the needs of employers, helping them to connect to the economy and continuing to innovate and evolve our economy. Three is that it's important to connect systems, whether it's connecting within education, secondary and post-secondary, whether it's connecting education and workforce programs, whether it's connecting in education systems with support networks. And last, and certainly not least, is the importance and the vigilance on quality, access, and equity, three tenets that I think are absolutely essential to being able to justify the federal investment in education. And so with that, not bad, not quite 5 minutes, but darn close. I'll turn it back to Steve. Thanks.
Wow, we're going to have to put you on the History Channel. I appreciate that, and you know, it's not a small feat to try to cram it in there, but I think there's a lot that I didn't even know, and hearing you say it kind of reaffirms the importance and the history of CTE, so thank you. I want to next we're going to turn to Q&A, but we want to introduce our panel, and I know most of them already pretty well. We're going to ask them to introduce themselves. I've got Chris Martini, who is with the Arlington Public Schools, Kathy Oliver, who previously worked for the Maryland Department of Education and was the CTE director in that state, and Jessica Straight, whom I just met, who is a Technology Student Association student from the Virginia Technology Student Association, and she came up from Bristol, Tennessee today. And finally, Kim, whom you've already met, and I should have said earlier, is a great partner. Our organizations work very collaboratively. So would you mind if we started with Jessica and went this way on introductions? Or if you'd rather not, Jessica, we can.
Okay, as Mr. DeWitt said, I am the state president of the Virginia Technology Student Association. I'm a junior at Abingdon High School, and I guess my major STEM competitions are website design and chapter team, which is the study of parliamentary procedure, and those are my TSA competitions out of the 35 or so that we offer to different high school students, including promotional design, fashion design, music production, all sorts of CTE-related competitions.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kathy Oliver, and I was the Assistant State Superintendent, most recently known as the Division of Career and College Readiness at the Maryland State Department of Education. I was there for 1/4 of these acts implementation, the last quarter, thank goodness. And but since 1989, I led the work as the CTE State Director in Maryland. Our name has changed a couple of times. We were originally, I was appointed as the Assistant State Superintendent for Vocational Technical Education. As I arrived on in my new office, I found a report from a commission on vocational technical education called Fulfilling the Promise that suggested that one of the first things I needed to do was figure out a new name for this enterprise. So in 1990, we changed our name to Career and Technical Education, and right in line with Perkins 2. And then as we looked at, as Perkins evolved, we kept up with the times and have been advocates of career and college readiness since the early part of this century.
Good afternoon. I'm Chris Martini. I'm from Arlington Public Schools in Arlington, Virginia. I'm the Director of Career, Technical, and Adult Education. I've been in education for about 25 years. Before that, after I graduated from college, I went into the woodworking industry for about 10 years. So I had some woodworking experience and business experience. Actually, before I got into teaching, I was teaching technology education at the high school and middle school level. For about the past 16 years, though, I've been in administration as the technology education supervisor, curriculum supervisor for technology education, also for the trade and industrial classes. And then I became director for career and technical and adult education at Arlington Public Schools. Thank you.
And Kim, you've met, so.
I just get to talk about things these people do.
Kim, our resident historian. And Kathy, I apologize. You brought up a point about your tenure in Maryland, which made me think I kind of minimized your role. But in a lot of states, the academic side and the career tech side are really merging together. And so apologies for that. So the first question we have is, we've had this great history given by Kim and wanted people to really talk a little more, thinking about that last 100 years of their own personal experience on the panel and the ways that you've seen career and technical education evolve over the course of your careers. And I told Jessica that these questions, obviously your career hasn't, well, maybe it's begun, but it's got a long path before you. So for you, maybe thinking or sharing a little bit about the Technology Student Association in Virginia and your CTSO and how that's provided you with the skills that you think you'll need in your career as you go forward. So I don't know, anybody can start, so volunteers?
I'll start.
Thanks, Kathy.
As I mentioned, over 25 years ago, I started to work with CTE, and I've seen it evolve from what was probably considered a lesser than part of our K-12 system to, when well executed, a robust pathway for students for career and college upon graduation that's now an integral part of what we call our P20 systems as we have linked the learning levels together. In 1989, who would have thought that in 2017, engineering, biomedical sciences, secondary teacher academies, and computer science would be the in-demand CTE programs of study in our state and I think across this country? Who would have thought that states and local school systems would be searching for indicators of career readiness to include in their accountability systems? And who would have thought that we would be using industry credentials to signal to the world what our CTE students were graduating with in terms of what they knew and were able to do? So as Kim and I walked here today, I said probably what I should say is that we've come a long way, baby. But CTE has really emerged to take its place, I think, as a huge component of our educational systems across all those learning levels.
I will add to that. I think when I first came in, when I was in high school, actually, I was going on to college, so it was very difficult for me to get into some of the vocational classes. And it was really the part of my parents that, working with my counselor to get me into those classes. And I was able to get into some of the drafting classes. I did go off into college, and then actually my first job was because I had that background in drafting. So that was kind of an interesting thing. And I think if we look at where we are now, a lot of our classes also have industry certifications with those. So they're validating the skills that students have so they can actually go out to work or go on to college and then have those validated skills for after they graduate. I think we also prepare our students more for careers. We have a very robust career exploration within our career and technical education programs. That's an integral part. Students not only see that they could become an auto tech, but they see the many aspects of the auto industry, so that if they don't want to just turn wrenches, they could be into sales, they could be in insurance, they could be in finance if they really have that love of cars. We have 2 girls right now that are seniors. They've been in the automotive program. They're in Automotive 3 right now. They've gone out on internships. One of them has 2 offers for full ride to Michigan and to Wisconsin for engineering. The other girl is looking at some of the Virginia schools for engineering. So, you know, who would have thought, you know, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, we'd have females that were in the automotive industry really becoming engineers. So I think we have those experiences. The other thing that I'd like to say is, you know, we have cybersecurity too as some of the new ones that we probably wouldn't have thought of even a few years back. And we also provide dual enrollment for our students. So students can get college credit while they're in high school in a lot of our career and technical classes.
Hey, Chris, could I ask you, you talked about kind of some of the barriers that you weren't able to enter those courses when you were back in school. What were the reasons for that?
Most of it was because I was going on to college. And if you're going to go on to college, you didn't need to take the vocational track. You know, I was looking at either architecture, or I just wanted to, you know, to make things, engineering. But I wasn't able to, you know, take the carpentry classes.
So
the funny thing is when you start looking at, you know, when I was in the industry, I look at some of the things that the architects would have designed, and they really didn't have that building experience, and we were trying to figure out how to make what they were designing. So, you know, having that hands-on opportunity, I think, is really valuable for anybody.
Thank you.
Kind of playing off the whole thing with the career and technical education centers, I live in a really rural area, and sometimes, like, our AP classes aren't the best that they could be, and I'm the first person to say that, trust me. But we actually have a phenomenal technical education center. I've taken classes there for 2 years. I'm working on getting my advertising and design NOCD certification this year. And I think just the thought 30 years ago of students being able to go in for 2.5 hours a day and study computer-aided drafting or study cosmetology was just unheard of. And now, especially with the existence of the CTSO, like TSA or Skills USA, it gives students a chance to practically apply those skills. Like, you know, you might have your class to sit and work on CAD and do your drafting, but it's when you go with several hundred other students and compete with that, when you have a prompt, when you have a goal that you're working towards, you can really apply those skills into something that you'll use in the workforce. And I just wanted to add to that because I think that you're right, and a lot of people think that if you're attending college, then you can't take CTE classes, and that's definitely not true anymore. I'm still getting my advanced diploma, and I'm taking, you know, 4 extra classes with the CTE Center. It's definitely possible, and I think that's something that should definitely be made known to students.
Jessica, do you think a lot of the students who are in your school recognize that value? Or, I mean, you obviously do. You're in the career tech program. I was wondering about the students who are in those AP courses. Do they often take the CTE courses as well, or see the value in them?
In my particular area, we have a separate high school and a CTE center that all 4 of the high schools feed into. And I think that some of the the high school guidance counselors don't do a really good job of explaining that. But the staff at the Career and Technical Education Center is excellent. They'll work with you to make your schedule fit. If you can only take 1 block as opposed to 2, they'll work with you so you can get your hours. And I think a lot of students don't realize it, but if they talk to the right people, then the teachers are willing to work with you.
Great, thank you. Kim? Okay. So our next question is really about the skills gap and the skills needs that we're facing today. A lot of industries, Fortune 1000 companies, are talking about the number of STEM degrees they're going to need, even including 2-year degrees. And there's also a lot of discussion about the millions of job openings in the coming years that will require less than a bachelor's degree. So the question is really about, in your experiences, do you think CTE is an effective way to meet those workforce demands from what you've seen in terms of your roles?
I'll start at the macro level, and what I will say is I think obviously the federal legislation's history is exactly about this, of meeting the needs of whatever the needs of the economy and labor market are. I think what's evolving is that those needs need to be thought about both as a short-term need and a long-term need. And so I think vocational education was about meeting short-term needs, filling the jobs that were open today. and how do we fill those job openings immediately? I think the nuance now that we're trying to figure out is how do you prepare for jobs that don't exist today? How do you help students who are in upper elementary school and middle grade start to think about the evolution of what are foundational skills that you may need and need to understand how do you adapt and apply your skill set in an ever-changing kind of labor market. And so while we have persisting jobs that are in maybe the infrastructure space, whether it's construction, welding, jobs that you can't outshore, we have tremendous influxes in terms of technology, and that technological advancements in all different aspects of the economy, we don't know what that's going to look like. And so how do you think about preparing those needs? And I think we've seen CTE respond to that in terms of a shift and away from just preparing individuals for jobs to preparing them for careers. And that shift is now having a broader, more enduring skill set that is not just very narrow and specific to a single occupation, but can be applicable to a full industry. In our parlance, that language is called a career cluster, and thinking about 16 of them that represent the entirety of the entire economy.
Great. And I heard what you just said really was what Chris was talking about earlier in terms of your daughters, I believe it was, people going on, getting those broad skill sets that allow them to maneuver throughout those career clusters or career areas. Another question we have is really about, 100 years ago it was vocational, and as you described, it was kind of singular. You went into a job right after high school usually. And today, more than 75% of students, I believe it is, CTE students really are going on to post-secondary education. So what would you tell parents, and this kind of goes back to what Jessica was saying, what would you tell parents that think CTE classes or courses are really kind of limiting their student as opposed to opening up opportunities for pathways?
Well, I would tell parents, and I have told parents, that their sons and daughters shouldn't just take a CTE course or a class. They need to be enrolled in a CTE program of study that culminates in that credential, that industry credential, or that early college credit. I'd also tell that parent that their son or daughter needs to take the additional rigorous academic courses, a complement of academic courses, including AP courses, and that they need to work with their child's school and guidance counselor, much like we just heard from Jessica, to ensure that the school schedule can accommodate students being able to do both while they're in school, because students can do both. We've demonstrated that in our state. In the early 90s, we asked our school systems to increase the number of CTE program completers that also met the course requirements for entrance into the University System of Maryland. That meant they had that college preparation in school. When we first started to encourage school systems to do this, our measurement of that goal was that 14% of CTE completers also met the course requirements for entrance into the University of Maryland. With putting that as a goal, with putting that as an objective for our school systems, over the years, that number has increased to today. I think that it hovers right around 60% of Maryland's CTE completers, program completers, also meet the requirements for entrance into the university systems of Maryland schools. So it can be done. The data show it can be done. We just need to work our systems to make this more of an opportunity for our students.
I would add to that as well that what we're trying to do in some of our classes, we have Arlington Tech is our new program that we're doing over at our Career Center, where students will be there for the full day. And we're looking at that integration of academics and career and technical classes so that the students can actually see the application of that science and math as they're going through. So that's kind of one of the things, too, that I think is very important. Sometimes the students will go through their math and their science, but they won't see the connection between. And this allows students to be able to do that. Again, I think the validation of the skills by having the credentials at the end will also shows parents that students are learning very valuable skills that can be applied into the workplace, whether they are going out after high school, after a 2-year, or after a 4-year degree. So I think those are also pluses for our career and technical education program.
And Jessica, I know you are a student, and I think it's hard to believe that you're a junior, right, in high school? But what do you think in terms of the skills you're learning and your aspirations? Like, where do you plan to go with your career tech degrees or credentials?
For me personally, after high school, I want to major in information technology at a public school. I'm looking at Penn State as my top choice right now. But for other students that have been in TSA, I can tell you, the student who actually started my school's TSA chapter is working for Bitcoin now. Our manufacturing prototype team from last year are majoring in computer science and human-centered computing and microbiology. It's crazy, the past that they wouldn't necessarily explore if it wasn't for TSA. I mean, I can say as someone who's taken a CTE class, you know, I get up in the morning, I go to science, I go to math, I go to foreign language, but I know that my CTE class is what I'm going to use for a career. And I think, I'm not going to say the academic side isn't important, because it absolutely is, and it's what's going to get me through secondary education, but CTE is what's going to put me on the path to my career.
And I know I don't know if most people are familiar with career tech student organizations, but can you tell people a little bit about, I know you mentioned the competitions, but when do you meet? What do you do in those in
Absolutely.
TSA?
All right. TSA stands for the Technology Student Association. We are 250,000 students nationwide and in Germany and Turkey. We are based primarily around STEM competitions. I listed a few of them off there, about 35 for high school and 35 for middle school. Like I said, my personal favorite is Webmaster, which our prompt this year is augmented reality, and you research the topic, create a website based off of it. Manufacturing prototypes are a really big project. With a lot of it, it's really, you get a prompt, you get your set of rules, and the student has to create something with what they've learned in their technical education. There's digital video production. Let's say, I think last year the prompt was cyberbullying, and the students don't have regulations for what has to be in the video, and they need to use what they've learned to create it and present it to the judges. I know other really common CTSOs, Skills USA is big. I'm actually in that at my technical center. It's kind of another counterpart of TSA with more emphasis on like auto body and cosmetology. They have those sort of competitions. FBLA, Future Business Leaders of America, DECA, which doesn't actually stand for anything. It's kind of the marketing counterpart. There are 7 or 8 major CTSOs that students can participate in based on what their class choices are. TSA and Skills are the big ones for CTE. DECA and FBLA, are for marketing and business classes. So really, whatever a student wants their career path to be, there is a CTSO that they can put with their coursework.
Thank you. Very helpful.
Steve, could I add?
Yes.
So you asked about what we would tell parents. So our organization, with the support of the Siemens Foundation, just did a set of focus groups with parents and students, and we did them in Bethesda, Maryland, in Jackson, Mississippi, and Columbus, Ohio, so that we had some diversity in terms of the education level and income level, and diversity in terms of populations. And what is unsurprising to me, kind of when you talk to parents, is a lot of the people who advocate for CTE, and I'm going to say this lovingly to our employer partners, is they say the wrong thing. The first thing they say is, not everybody needs a 4-year college degree. No parent wants to hear that, even if it's true. No kid wants to hear that, even if it's true. We know that there's lots of options after high school, and there's lots of different credentials, and we've made a ton of headway in terms of acknowledging that there's lots of different options. But taking away options from parents, anything that we do or say in the negative, does not resonate with them. The second thing that we didn't hear from the focus groups, that I'll say from my own experience, is that I think it's essential for us to be truth tellers. Not every CTE program is of the same quality. And there are some programs that probably should still be called vocational education because they accomplish those goals. And that we as policymakers and those who work within the system, I think, have to be truth tellers about what is, and hold our programs accountable for the standards that we want them to meet. Because we don't build trust with especially underserved populations if we're not truthful and recognizing that every program doesn't meet that standard. And what does that mean with that? That means that we have the responsibility of supporting those programs in terms of their transformation and holding them to that standard. And to me, and the conversation of federal policy, that's one of our responsibilities, is providing those supports to help transform those programs.
Yeah, I'm really interested, when you were talking about parents, in the focus groups that you're conducting. I know we've also been talking to the National PTA and other audiences to try to get the message about these programs out to parent audiences as well. And I agree with you. I think not every program is of the same quality.
Well, I will say seeing is believing. So if any of you who are for members' offices haven't been to a program, go see one. Because even when probably, although many of you are much younger than I am, the programs that were in place when you were there probably look a whole lot different now. And if they don't, then we have an opportunity for transformation. The second thing that we also learn from students is that high-achieving students don't understand how they can do this and do the coursework that they're doing now, because they think it's AP or it's IB or, and so they don't understand the transformative power of thinking about a career technical education program of academic, it's the college and career-ready academic and technical education. So I think we have to work to try to demonstrate the and is possible and to showcase for students, both young adults and older adults, kind of how that and is possible.
Great. So we've talked a lot about the past and the present, and now I want to talk a little more about the future. We've referenced it a bit. But what are your predictions in terms of the next wave of career and technical education? What is it going to look like, or do you have any hints for us on things you maybe have seen that are going to grow bigger? Don't worry, Jessica, I'm not going to hold you to the fire on this one.
Well, I think that that CTE will emerge in this next round as a leading producer of students for STEM industries. CTE is a perfect fit for beginning at the high school level, moving on into post-secondary education, for careers in engineering, for careers that require the application of science and math and technology, as we look at information technology and computer science. I think that as we move forward, the concept of program of study at the high school level will certainly take hold. At least I hope it will. That may be wishful thinking, but I'm convinced that that industry will be at our side and help us understand and communicate the need for students to progress through a logical sequence of courses that culminates in an industry certification, that culminates in that early college credit, so that that students are advancing forward in their careers while they start in high school. I think we'll see more informed and more comprehensive career advisement as we work together to figure out how to best package and provide that information for students, as we work within our high schools to have career plans that become college plans, that become high school plans, that help students think about education as a preparation for the future, not education as just a means, as an end in itself. I know many of us are fond, my poor staff used to hate me when I said this, that we need to begin with the end in mind. But we do, and I think that that CTE helps our students with that. Good career advisement helps our students begin to pursue their education with that end in mind. And I think that as we move forward, the stigma of CTE, that which we're always dealing with, that Kim just spoke to in terms of our employers sometimes being not as helpful as we'd like them to be when they talk about CTE being for the non-college bound, and not everyone needs that college degree. I'm hoping that in the future we start talking about post-secondary education, not college education. I had a state board president one time who had a huge aha when we talked about the fact that post-secondary education included four-year colleges, but included a lot of other types of education as well. And so if we were able in a next iteration of the Act to be focused on post-secondary learning, not just college learning, I think that would be helpful, and I have great hopes that will happen as well.
I would concur with that, but I'd also include some of the things that we are doing in career and technical education already, since we don't know what some of our students may be going into or the future careers that they may be going into, is creativity and innovation, problem solving, so that they have this ability to take that problem-solving approach and apply it to any different career that they would be in, whether we know what it is now or what it may look like. I think the other thing that I think we will see as we're moving forward, and we're starting to implement that now, but I would see that more in the future, is some of those work-based learning experiences, the job shadowing opportunities, the internships, and the co-oping opportunities for students to actually get out into the world of work and really see what it's all about, get more of those soft skills and see how some of their skills that they are learning would apply, or how that that creativity and innovation would be able to be incorporated within what they're doing as well. So I think those are some of the things as I look at maybe how we might be providing some of the classes. I'm thinking there could be more online, maybe opportunities for students to be able to get some of their education at home 24/7, and then maybe coming into labs to really get the hands-on part of it. So I think it'll be very interesting as we start looking at education, and maybe it won't be, in the bricks and mortar for the full time. I think we will never outgrow some of our labs, but they could go virtual. So students would be able to do some of that at home, some of the virtual learning, and then coming in and getting the hands-on and applied. So as we kind of look at where the future of career and technical education is, I think it's very bright, and I think with some of our students like Jessica, she'll be able to help us take us in that next direction in the field that she might be going into.
Jessica, is there anything in your current program, and feel free to say no, that you think is kind of innovative or different that you don't think other schools are doing? And it may be traditional, which is fine, but if...
Do you mean like my career and technical education program, or just like my high school's
Yeah, career and tech
technology?
programs.
I just think it's two different schools, so I have to like switch gears for a second.
And I'm sorry, I put you on the
Oh,
spot.
you're fine. I really enjoy my technical education class is like the highlight of my day, which is such a lame thing to say. But I mean, that's the class I look forward to going to every day because I know I'm going to sit there and do something that I actually enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
I guess one interesting thing that we do is we put a lot of emphasis on like the skills. Like every student in the school is registered with Skills USA, regardless of if your class has a competition for it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we have like 3 different nursing classes, and not all of them have a Skills USA competition, but the students are still registered so that if they want to maybe like work with the other class, like as opposed to just doing medical terminology, maybe they want to work with the practical nursing and learn a little bit more about that field.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought that was something interesting that we did, because even if you're not enrolled with the class, you can work with the students there to see what they're doing for their competition and kind of try out, see if it's maybe something you'd be interested in.
That's
I
great.
always thought that was something nice
Yeah,
that we did.
absolutely. Thank you. Kim, did you have anything you
I
want
feel like I should say bingo because I like checked off all these things as Kathy and Chris and Jessica were talking. I guess the only thing that I would add to this is I think that we are, and this isn't necessarily new, everything old is new again, is this reaching back to the middle grades and having these conversations earlier so that we're not losing students. When I was in middle school, we did a quarter of woodworking, a quarter of metalworking, a quarter of cooking, and a quarter of sewing, and obviously those would be different today, but helping kids think about and get a chance to test out kind of what do you like to do, what are you good at, and give you some focus and intentionality through high school, and that applying to all kids. So I guess my second thing would be I'd love to keep the value of what CTE contributes to students without having to use the label so that more kids could have access to this, right? And so beginning, whether it's silo smashing or blurring lines or whatever, but that we honor those contributions without having to stigmatize it as something separate. And I guess the last thing that I would speak to that no one else spoke to was really getting students and educators to be empowered and have access to data to help guide instruction and choices that they make, and for them to be able to have the supports that they need to understand how to use that information. We use data in every other part of our lives in terms of making good choices. And I will say, as a side, in the focus groups that we had with students, we would make claims about what CTE does, and every single one of the student focus groups, they said, prove it, where's your data point? So, so that I think
Fair
is
enough.
emerging and will be here faster than we know it.
Great. And I'm going to make a prediction. You said middle schools and elementary, and I think that is a place where there's going to be growth in the future. I think there's going to be a lot more focus in that in early learning and helping students to start to think about careers earlier. We're actually going to be releasing a paper this March around middle schools, because we've seen an evolving growth in those career tech programs around the country and in career development, and so we're going to be putting out some information on best practices in that area. So let's shift now. We're in Congress, and the whole issue of Perkins and the Perkins Act. I know the last Congress got close to approving a bill, at least in the House. They did approve their bill, and the Senate was close as well. And now we're hearing that there may be some activity coming up this spring at some point. So just wondering, where do you see Perkins in terms of its impact at the local program level, or even at the state level as well, Kathy? I know you were there. And Jessica, don't worry, I know this, unless you want to enter that conversation, maybe you know more about Perkins than I think you do. Maybe Kim, you should start with this. I know you've got the expertise in this area.
I guess what I would say is, one, so grateful and thankful that Perkins and CTE has historically been a bipartisan issue, and so I think this is one that we can hopefully get across the finish line, because it retains that bipartisan support as evidenced by the caucus, both here and on the House side. So I think one is, it would be great to have the federal legislation continue to lead on innovation, as we've looked at the work that has been done across the history in the federal investment. There have been pieces where the federal legislation kind of incentivized a new behavior, like tech prep did with secondary and post-secondary connections, or moving in the space of accountability. So honoring and recognizing the importance of having resources that you can innovate with. Second would be that it's really important to have a research investment, that states and locals are not able to do this. And if we want to make good, sound investments, we need to continue to have that focus on research. And I guess the last thing I will say is that I think, as an organization that represents states, it's important to have a framework of quality that the federal government puts out, but recognizing the important role and the variability of the way that states do interpret this federal investment is important. And many of you may know, we didn't mention this earlier, but Perkins is the only piece of education legislation where the states get to decide kind of what agency at the state level governs this investment. And in 2/3 of the states, it's the state education agency, but in 1/3 of the states, it's some other agency. It might be the university system, it might be a workforce system, workforce education, a community college system. And so again, honoring and recognizing that career technical education has a different role and a space within different states, and we need to recognize and honor the role that it plays in those states. So I'll stop there.
Well, at the state level, the Perkins funding has been critically important to us. Interestingly enough, it represents about $1 for every 10 that is spent on career and technical education in our state. But it is a huge driver of change as we collaboratively develop a state plan that then is implemented with its requirements for school systems and our community colleges. It allows us to be a little bit more directive in terms of implementing a vision for the future. Sometimes it's not always wildly embraced, as when we announced that we were moving to industry credentials for the way in which we would measure the technical skill attainment measure. And hands went up about, how do I contact my congressman on that? And I had to say, I'm sorry, it's a little too late. The Congress has already weighed in on that, and this is what they would like us to do. So it has, and now, of course, people are embracing that concept, that approach to being able to credential learning for our students. But it has allowed us to, I think, appropriately set the stage for expectations for our school systems. We've always, in our states, we have high expectations for those school systems and community colleges. It's allowed us to be able to look at what are the quality measures, how we benchmark each and every one of our recipients against their established goals, and it's the important push that we need. So while we would always benefit from additional or more funding, it plays an an incredibly important role in helping to influence how state and local education dollars are spent. At least that was the case in Maryland, and I think that can be said across the country.
I would say at the local level, we have our Perkins funds that allows us to do a number of things. Some of the things that we do with them is our professional development for our teachers to make sure we are bringing them up to the level that they need to be so they can do the high quality courses that we are expecting. Also to help improve our courses so that we don't have the vocational, but we are all areas of excellence. And it helps us keep up to date with some of the new equipment. If we do not meet some of our goals or our benchmarks from the state, then we have to use our Perkins funds specifically for those areas to address those areas where we're low. Some of those are non-traditional students. How do we get more non-traditional students within our CTE classes? And non-traditional students are, for example, females in the automotive classes, males in cosmetology. So how do we go ahead and work with that if we have not met those goals? Additionally, it helps us with our testing of our students for our credentialing, and it also gives us opportunities to try different things. One of the things we're doing this year, this is going to be our second year that we'll be supporting it through Perkins, is we're working with our HILT department, and we have a SIOP coach, which is Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol, that will help our second language learners with language acquisition. If you know, career and technical education has a lot of technical terms, not only for our English speaking students, learning those technical terms, but also our second language learners doing that. So we're teaching our teachers how to work with second language learners so that we can bring their language up to where it needs to be proficient so that they can pass these credentials, so they can get industry credentials, and so they can go on to post-secondary education. That's been a huge success. I was looking at our numbers today. We're just starting to work on our Perkins plan for our locality. And we have met all of our benchmarks. Two of them that we didn't meet were our special needs students, which are, so part of those are the second language learners. And we have met those benchmarks this year, so we will continue on. And it'll be a nice vote of confidence for our teachers that this is working and we're going to continue it, and so it will continue to work. So those are some of the things that we do use our Perkins funds for. It is helpful. We are very happy of the funds we get. We could always use more, but it does allow us to do some many different things and keeps us really at the cutting edge of technology with our students and with our equipment and with our teaching.
Thanks, Chris. We've only got about 5 or 10 minutes, and I want to make sure we open it up for questions. So does anybody have a question? Yes, Susan.
Hi, I'm Susan Smith-Hughes, formerly in CTE at the U.S. Department of Ed. And I'm wondering whether you think the push toward middle school focus may get bottom half of the kids motivated to move into, because I know we do very well with the students who are in career and technical ed, but we're missing so many young people who then don't have the skills to be successful in post-secondary because they never develop them. So are you thinking about how a move toward middle school might motivate those students to develop their skills and be more successful when they get to high school?
And I'm just going to repeat that, but since we are live streaming, the question is about middle school, if that will help us really motivate students who traditionally have not been successful in skills building. Is that accurate?
Well, let me start, because I agree with you, Susan. I think that much like preparation for careers, you can't start preparing for your career as you graduate from any institution, let alone can you start at day one in high school thinking about what is going to be your high school plan. I've always been a huge advocate of career advisement and exploration at that elementary, middle level, so that students have opportunities to see what that real world is all about, and how then they can make best use of their high school years. And very oftentimes, the best coaches for that are high school students, going back and working with middle school students. The elementary kids are all excited about everything, so we can start to capitalize on that excitement in middle school, I think, by being creative, by integrating perhaps into the curriculum ways in which students can apply what they're learning in academic content, as well as having some real opportunity to explore careers.
Any other responses? Good. Yes, ma'am. Sure. The question's about the priorities for Perkins reauthorization, which Kim might be able to talk about, or we could talk about our priorities.
Do you want to start?
Sure. I think our priorities really focused on the expansion of the programs of study that we talked about, and we looked at two areas, programs of study and career development, which have both been talked about today. Anything you want to add?
I mean, I think strengthening the connection to the labor market was one that we saw. We had kind of stepped away from that a bit when we thought that there was a focus on academics and it was kind of either or, and so kind of bringing back that strong connection to the labor market. I think importantly, seeing the connections between Perkins and other pieces of federal legislation, and so we're so happy to see the connection with ESSA and WIOA, and we'd like to see that kind of reciprocal connection within Perkins as well. And then I would say that while we certainly have recommended some tweaks to the accountability measures, using and beginning to kind of continue to, I guess, use the performance measures as a way of improving quality and holding systems accountable for, and having some consistency in terms of the quality. So I'd say the last piece is that both of our organizations have advocated for more definitions within the federal legislation. So not prescribing how a state or a local has to do something, but being clear on what we're talking about in terms of what we mean by high quality.
And just to note also, obviously Perkins, we think, is coming up this year. We do have recommendations, our organizations, on other bills like the Higher Education Act as well. So look at our websites, and we're happy to share that information as well. Yes?
Thomas Phillips with Patel. How do you view the relationship between STEM and CTE?
So the question is about how we view the relationship between STEM and CTE. I'm trying not to answer myself. Jessica, do you want to start? Because you probably have. Go ahead.
I actually would like to start on this. For me, STEM and CTE go hand in hand a lot of the time, but I also tend to not think of CTE as solely vocational. I know especially a lot of the older generations think of it that way, but for me, CTE is not just auto body or cosmetology. I think of it as our cybersecurity programs. You can get IT certified at our school technical center, and for me, the technology in STEM plays a lot into my technical education classes. I guess it's not entirely one and the same, but when I think STEM, I generally think technical education, but maybe that's just me, I don't know.
And I would add, I think it depends on the courses, obviously, but we do think there's a strong connection with STEM in many courses. A lot, when we were talking about the 2-year and less than a 4-year bachelor's degree, a lot of technicians are earning those credentials to go into STEM fields like IT, advanced manufacturing, whatever it may be. So yeah, we see a close connection. We actually have a poster that says STEM is CTE, or no, CTE is STEM, I believe. I always get it mixed up. One last question right here. Sorry.
There's a movement overall in the curriculum of all secondary schools to go towards project-based learning, as well as to make sure that you're getting skills that are going to be for jobs that we don't know what are approaching. So what I find very intriguing is there are schools like High Tech High, these project-based schools that are actually also having difficulty communicating to secondary schools how this course could be labeled as science. So we're moving away from traditional concepts of chemistry or biology or physics, and we're now doing integrated sciences, which is a lot of what's going on with STEM careers. So my question is, how are you interfacing and/or messaging to four-year institutions about giving credit, not just the full credit, but actually recognizing that those courses are STEM courses?
So I'll try to synopsize that, but I think the question is about the move towards project-based learning and the labeling of courses, and how do we address that issue with post-secondary in terms of ensuring that they're capturing something. I missed the last part, but anybody care to take that one on?
I would say that, that as we start looking at our classes and the integration of those, we try to promote really what is in the descriptions on what is included in with that. We have looked at actually the way that we title them, because when student transcripts go to the colleges, that's really what they see. So we are just looking at the way that they're tagged that way. As far as we're doing project-based learning, students are still in, some of the chemistry and the Algebra 2. So we still have those tagged that way, but it's the way that the teaching is done. The teachers are working together. They're looking at a project that's incorporating each of the different areas, and they're bringing that into their different classes. So I think we can still label them and get it across that these students are meeting these classes, but the way that it's taught in the classroom and within the program is different, and that's really making it beneficial for students to be able to see those connections. We are trying to bring some of the colleges in. I think also dual enrollment gives immediate college credit, so when a transcript goes, they can see that a student has that level. And if we are, providing those dual enrollment classes within these classes as well, that's another way that will help do that. I don't know, we're working on that. I think the more of these type of programs that are out there, then the colleges will start seeing those and seeing the quality of students that come out, and I think that will help as well.
And by the way, I think about a third of the dual enrollment courses out there are CTE. I think people don't really always understand or recognize that.
I'd just add to that, I'd recommend that you take a look at the work that's been done by Project Lead the Way in its pre-engineering and biomedical sciences programs. Those are all project-based learning courses and programs. And when I was in Maryland, we worked with higher education institutions that would examine those courses, the outcomes of those courses, and award college credit for, sometimes it was the 4 unit of study became 2 college credit, or yes, 2 college, not 6 college credits, excuse me. And the translation from high school to college has always been a mind boggler. But they have perfected the system of developing good curriculum and instruction, actually starting with the instruction and then backing into how it supports the curriculum. And it's just an elegant approach that is very transparent to the post-secondary world as well.
So I think we're going to end there. I've got 3:32. I want to thank the panel, Kim, Chris, Kathy, and Jessica very much. Have a good day.